Good evening. Tonight, I'm going to begin a novel, a contemporary novel, that is a favorite of mine. It is entitled BRAT FARRAR. Now, Josephine Tey was the nom de plume of Elizabeth McIntosh. She wrote 8 novels, each of them so different from the others that had she written more, we have no idea what they would have been like, except that they would have been beautifully written and very intriguing. Now this one, BRAT FARRAR, let me read the blurb at the back. In BRAT FARRAR, Josephine Tey has created one of the most attractive imposters in mystery fiction. Young Farrar, the product of an orphanage upbringing, closely resembles the dead heir, presumably a suicide, to the small but prosperous British estate of Latchets. Against his better judgment, Farrar is persuaded to pose as Patrick Ashby, the heir, and claim the inheritance. Most of the Ashby are roused as to what really happened to Patrick. And when an attempt is made on his own life, Brat realizes that Patrick was murdered. And by whom? But to reveal it, he will have to reveal his own fraud. As the New York Times said when this was published, as pretty a dilemma as the hero of a detective story has encountered in some time, the ingenious plot. Now, I'm getting that message constantly coming back, trying to reconnect. I don't know if the connection is broken. I'll just ignore it and keep going. So, one of my very favorite contemporary novels, BRAT FARRAR by Josephine Tey. Aunt Bee, said Jane, breathing heavily into her soup, was Noah a cleverer backroom boy than Ulysses, or was Ulysses a cleverer backroom boy than Noah? Don't eat out of the point of your spoon, Jane. I can't mobilize the strings out of the side. Ruth does. Jane looked across at her twin, negotiating the vermicelli with smug neatness. Aunt Bee has a face like a very expensive cat, Ruth said, eyeing her aunt sideways. Bee privately thought this was a very good description, but she wished that Ruth would not be quaint. No, but which was the cleverest, said Jane, who never departed from a path once her feet were on it. Cleverer, said Ruth. Was it Noah or Ulysses? Simon, which was it, do you think? Ulysses, said her brother, not looking up from his paper. It was so like Simon, Bee thought, to be reading the list of runners at Newmarket, peppering his soup, and listening to the conversation at one and the same time. Why, Simon, Met service. Whereabouts was Firelight in the Free Handicap, do you remember? Oh, way down, Bee said. A coming of age is a little like a wedding, isn't it, Simon? This was Ruth. Better on the whole. Is it? You can stay and dance at your own coming of age, which you can't at your wedding. I shall stay and dance at my wedding. I wouldn't put it past you. Oh dear, thought Bee. I suppose there are families that have conversations at meals, but I don't know how they manage it. Perhaps I haven't been strict in the 3 bent heads and Eleanor's still vacant place, and wondered if she had done right by them. Would Bill and Nora be pleased with what she had made of their children? If by some miracle they could walk in now, young and fine-looking and gay as they had gone to their deaths, would they say, ah, yes, this is just how we picture them, even to Jane's ragamuffin look? Bee's eyes smiled as they rested on Jane. The twins were 9 going on 10 and identical. Identical, that is to say, in the technical sense. In spite of their physical resemblance, there was never any doubt as to which was Jane and which was Ruth. They had the same straight and pale skin, the same direct gaze with a challenge in it, but there the identity stopped. Jane was wearing rather grubby jumpers and a shapeless jersey festooned with pulled ends of wool. Her hair was pushed back without aid of mirror and held in the uncompromising clasp of a Kirby grip so old that it had reverted to its original steel color, as old hairpins do. She was slightly astigmatic, and when in the presence of authority, was in the habit of wearing horn-rimmed spectacles. Normally, they lived in the hip pocket of her breeches, and they had been lent upon, permanent state of bankruptcy, breakages over the yearly allowance having to be paid for out of her money box. She rode to and fro lessons at the rectory on four-poster, the old white pony, her short legs sticking out on either side of him like straws. Four-poster had long become a conveyance rather than a ride, so it did not matter that his great barrel was as manageable as a feather bed and almost as wide. Ruth, on the other hand, wore a pink cotton frock, as rectory. Her hands were clean and the nails unbroken, and somewhere she had found a pink ribbon and had tied the two side pieces of her hair in a bow on the top of her head. 8 years, Bea was thinking. 8 years of conniving, conserving, and planning. And in 6 weeks' time, her stewardship would come to an end. In little more than a month, Simon would be 21 and would inherit his mother's fortune, and the lean years would be over. The Ashbys had never been rich, but while her brother lived, there was the 3 farms on the estate, as it should be kept. Only his sudden death had accounted for the near poverty of those 8 years. And only Bea's own resolution accounted for the fact that her sister-in-law's money would, next month, come to her son intact. There had been no borrowing on the strength of that future inheritance. Not even Mr. Sandal of Cossack, Thrigg, and Noble had been prepared to countenance it. Latchets must pay its way, Bea had said. And Latchets, after 8 years, was still self-supporting and solvent. Beyond her nephew's fair head, she could see through the window the white rails of the south paddock and the flick of old Regina's tail in the sunlight. The horses that had been her brother's hobby had proved the salvation of his house. Year after year, in spite of all the ills, accidents, and sheer cussedness that afflict horseflesh, the horses had shown a profit. The swings had always paid a little more than the roundabouts. When the original small stud that had been her brother's delight seemed likely to be a doubtful prop, Bea had added the small hardy children's ponies to occupy the colder pastures halfway up the downs into safe rides for a lady, and had sold them at a profit. And now that the manor was a boarding school, she was teaching others to ride at a very respectable price per hour. Eleanor's very late, isn't she? Is she out with La Parslow? Simon asked. The Parslow girl, yes. The unhappy horse has probably dropped dead. Simon got up to take away the soup plates and to help out the meat course from the sideboard. At least she had managed not to spoil Simon, and that, given Simon's selfish charm, was no small achievement. Simon had an air of appealing dependence that was quite fallacious, but it had fooled all and sundry since he was in the nursery. Bea had watched the fooling process with amusement and something that was like a reluctant admiration. If she herself had been gifted with Simon's particular brand of charm, she felt, she would in all likelihood have made it work for her as Simon did. But she had seen to it that it did not work with her. It would be nice if a coming of age had something like bridesmaids, Ruth observed, turning over her head. This fell on stony ground. The rector says that Ulysses was probably a frightful nuisance around the house, said the undeviating Jane. Oh, said Bee, interested in this sidelight on the classics. Why? He said he was, without doubt, a gadget contriver, and that Penelope was probably very glad to be rid of him for a bit. I wish liver wasn't so smooth. Eleanor came in and helped herself from the sideboard in her usual silent fashion. Pah, said Ruth, what a smell of stables. You're late, Nell, Bee said, inquiring. She'll never roll yet. Perhaps loony people can't ride, Ruth suggested. Ruth, Bee said with vigor, the people at the manor are not lunatic. They are not even mentally deficient. They are just difficult. Ill-adjusted is the technical description, Simon said. Well, they behave like lunatics. If you behave like a lunatic, how is anyone to tell that you're not one? Since no one had an answer to this, silence fell over the Ashby luncheon table. Eleanor ate with a swift purpose from her plate. Simon took out a pencil and reckoned odds on the margin of his paper. Ruth, who had stolen 3 biscuits from the jar on the rectory sideboard and eaten them in the lavatory, made a castle of her food with a moat of gravy round it. Jane consumed hers with industrious pleasure, and Bee sat with her eyes on the view beyond the window. Over that far ridge, the land sloped in checkered miles to the sea and the clustered roofs of Westover. But here, in this high valley, shut off from the Channel gales and open to the sun, with an air almost of enchantment. The scene had the bright perfection and stillness of an apparition. A fine inheritance, a fine, rich inheritance. She hoped that Simon would do well by it. There were times when she had, not been afraid. Times, perhaps, when she had wondered. Simon had far too many sides to him. A quicksilver quality that did not go hatchets of all the surrounding estates still sheltered a local family, and Bee hoped that it would go on sheltering Ashbys for centuries to come. Fair, small-boned, long-headed Ashbys, like the ones round the table. Jane, must you splash fruit juice round like that? I don't like rhubarb in inches, Aunt Bee. I like it in mush. Well, mush it. In Jane's age, she had mushed up her rhubarb too. And at this same table, had eaten Ashbys who had died of fever in India, of wounds in the Crimea, of starvation in Queensland, of typhoid at the Cape, and of cirrhosis of the liver in the Straits settlements. But always there had been an Ashby at Latchet's, and they had done well by the land. Here and there came a ne'er-do-well, like her cousin Walter. But Providence had seen to it that the worthless quality had been confined to younger sons, who could practice their waywardness on subjects remote from Latchet's. Lives to hide. For 300 years it had stood in its meadows very much as it stood now, a yeoman's dwelling. And for nearly 2 of those 300 years, Ashbys had lived in it. Simon, dear, see to the corner. Perhaps its simplicity had saved it. It had pretended to nothing, had aspired to nothing. Its goodness had been dug back into the earth. Its sap had lay. The long white house of Clare stood in its park, gracious as a vicereine. But there were no Lettinghams there now. The Lettinghams had been prodigal of their talents and their riches, using Clare as a background, as a purse, as a decoration, as a refuge. But not as a home. For centuries they had peacocked over the world as proconsuls, explorers, court jesters, rakes, and revolutionaries, and Claire had supported their extravagances. Now only their portraits remained, and the great house in the park was a boarding school for the unmanageable children of parents with progressive ideas and large bank accounts stayed at Latchett's. As Bea poured the coffee, the twins disappeared on ploys of their own, this being their half-holiday, and Eleanor drank hers hastily and went back to the stables. "Do you want the car this afternoon?" Simon asked. "I half promised old Gates that I would bring a calf out from Westover in one of our trailers. His own has collapsed." "No, I don't need it," Bea said, wondering what had prompted Simon so dull a chore. She was very silly and very commonplace. Gates was the tenant of Wigsell, the smallest of the 3 farms, and Simon was not normally tolerant of his opportunism. "If you really want to know," Simon said as he got up, "I want to see June Kay's new picture. It's at the Empire." The disarming frankness of this would have delighted anyone but Beatrice Ashby, who knew very well her nephew's habit of throwing up 2 balls to divert your attention from the 3rd. "Can I fetch you anything?" "You might get one of the new bus timetables from the Westover and district offices if you have time. Eleanor says they have a new..." "Bea," said a voice in the hall. "Are you there, Bea?" "Mrs. Peck," Simon said, going out to meet her. "Come in, Nancy," Bea called. "Come and have coffee with me. The others have finished." And the rector's wife came into the room, put her empty basket on the sideboard, and sat down with a pleased sigh. I could do with some. Will mention Mrs. Peck's name. They still added Nancy Lettingham that was, you know. Although it was a decade since she had stunned the social world by marrying George Peck and burying herself in a country rectory. Nancy Lettingham had been more than the debutante of her year. She had been a national possession. The penny press had done for her what the penny postcard had done for Lily Langtry. Her beauty was common property. If the public did not stand on chairs to see her pass, they certainly stopped the traffic. Her appearance as bridesmaid for a week beforehand. She had that serene, unquestionable loveliness that defeats even a willing detractor. Indeed, the only question seemed to be whether the ultimate coronet would have strawberry leaves or not. More than once the popular press had supplied her with a crown, but this was generally considered mere wishful thinking. Her public would settle for strawberry leaves, for a duchess. And then, quite suddenly, between a tattler and a tattler, so to speak, she had married George Peck. The shattered press, doing the best they could for a shattered public, had pulled out the Vox Humana stop and quavered about romance. But George had defeated them, with the face of a very intelligent and rather nice ape. Besides, as the society editor of the Clarion said, a clergyman, I ask you, I could get more romance out of a cement mixer. So the public let her go, into her chosen oblivion. Her aunt, who had been responsible for her coming out, disinherited her. Her father died in a welter of chagrin and debts. And her old home, the great white house in the park, had become a school. But after 13 years of rectory life, Nancy Peck was still serenely and unquestionably beautiful. And people still said, Nancy Lettingham that was, you know. But there's no hurry, is there? It's wonderful to sit and do nothing. Bea's eyes slid sideways at her in a smile. You have such a nice face, Bea. Thank you. Ruth says it is a face like a very expensive cat. Nonsense. At least, not the furry kind. Oh, I suppose I know what she that show their small chins. Heraldic cats. Yes, Bee, darling, you have a face like a heraldic cat, especially when you keep your head still and slide your eyes at people. She put her cup down and sighed again with pleasure. I can't think how the nonconformists have failed to discover coffee. Discover it? Yes, as a snare. It is far more for one than drink. About it? 5 mouthfuls, and the world looks rosy. Was it very grey before? A sort of mud color. I was so happy this week because it was the first week this year that we hadn't needed sitting room fires, and I had no fires to do and no fireplaces to clean. But nothing, I repeat, nothing will stop George from throwing his used matches into the fireplace. And as he takes 15 matches to light one pipe, the room swarms with waste paper baskets and with ashtrays. But no, George must use the fireplace. He doesn't even aim, blast him. A fine, careless flick of the wrist, and the match lands anywhere from the fender to be picked out again. And he says, why don't you leave them? He does. However, now that I've had some Latchett's coffee, I have decided not to take a chopper to him after all. Poor Nan. These Christians. How are the coming-of-age preparations getting on? The invitations are about to go to the printers, which is a nice, definite stage to have arrived at. A dinner for intimates here, and a dance for everyone in the barn. What is Alec's address, by the way? I can't remember his latest one offhand. I'll look it up for you. He has a different one almost every time he writes. I think he gets heaved out when he can't, and often, of course. He has never forgiven me for not marrying well, so that I could keep my only brother in the state to which he had been accustomed. Is he playing just now? I don't know. He had a part in that silly comedy at the Savoy, but it ran only a few weeks. He is so much a type that his parts are necessarily limited. Yes, I suppose so. No one could cast Alec as how lucky you are, Bee, to have Ashbys to deal with. The incidence of rakes in the Ashby family is singularly low. There was Walter, a lone wolf crying in the wilderness. What became of Cousin Walter? Oh, he died. In an odor of sanctity? No, carbolic. A workhouse ward, I think. Even Walter wasn't bad, you know. He just liked drink and hadn't the head for it. But when a Lettingham is bad as a rake, he is plain bad. They sat together in a comfortable silence, considering their respective families. Bee was several years older than her friend, almost a generation older, but neither, and the Lettingham children had gone in and out of Latchett's as if it were their home, as familiar with it as the Ashbys were with Claire. I have been thinking so often lately, of Bill and Nora, Nancy said. This would have been such a happy time for them. Yes, Bee said reflectively, her eyes on the window. It was on that view she had been looking when it happened. On a day very like this, and at this time of the year, standing in the sitting room window, thinking how lovely everything looked, and if they would think that nothing they had seen in Europe was Hatchett's, as if it were their home, as familiar with it as the Ashbys were with Claire. I have been thinking so often lately, of Bill and Nora, Nancy said. This would have been such a happy time for them. Yes, Bea said reflectively, her eyes on the window. It was on that view she had been looking when it happened. On a day very like this, and at this time of the year, standing in the sitting room window, thinking how lovely everything looked, and if they would think that nothing they had seen in Europe was half well again. She had been very pulled down after the twins' birth, hoping she had been a good deputy for them, and yet a little pleased to be resuming her own life in London tomorrow. The twins had been asleep, and the older children upstairs grooming themselves for the welcome and for the dinner they were to be allowed to stay up for. In half an hour or so, the car would swing out from the avenue of lime trees and come to rest at the door, and there they would be, in a flurry of laughter and embracing and present-giving and well-being. The turning on of the wireless had been so absent-minded a gesture, she did not know that she had done it. The 2 o'clock plane from Paris to London, said the cool voice, was crashed this afternoon just after crossing the Kent coast. There were no survivors. No, there had been no survivors. They were so wrapped up in the children, Nancy said. There have been so much in my mind lately, now that Simon is going to be 21. And Patrick has been in mine. Patrick? Nancy sounded at a loss. Oh, yes, of course. Poor Pat. Bea looked at her curiously. You had almost time ago, Bea. And, well, I suppose one's mind tidies away the things it can't bear to remember. Bill and Nora, that was frightful, but it was something that happened to people. I mean, it was part of the ordinary risks of life. But Pat, that was different. She sat silent for a moment. I have pushed it so far down in my mind that I can't even remember what he looked like anymore. Was he as like Simon as Ruth is like Jane? Oh, no. They weren't identical twins. Not much more alike than some brothers are, buckets than Ruth and Jane are. Simon seems to have got over it. Do you think he remembers it often? He must have remembered it very often lately. Yes, but it is a long way between 13 and 21. I expect even a twin grows shadowy at that distance. This gave Bea pause. How shadowy was he to her? The kind, solemn little boy who should have been coming into his inheritance next month. She tried to call up his face in front of her, but there was only a blur. He had been small and immature, less an individual than a family resemblance. All she really remembered, now she thought about it, was that he was solemn and kind. Kindness was not a common trait in small boys. Simon had a careless generosity when it did not cost him inconvenience. But Patrick had had that inner kindness that not only gives, but gives up. I still wonder, Bea said unhappily, whether we should have allowed the body that was found on the Castle beach to be buried over there. A pauper's burial it was. But Bea, it had been months in the water, hadn't it? They couldn't even be miles away, and they get all the corpses from the Atlantic founderings anyway. I mean, the nearest ones. It was not sense to identify. Her dismayed voice died into silence. No, of course it isn't, Bea said briskly. I'm just being morbid. Have some more coffee. And as she poured the coffee, she decided that when Nancy had gone, she would unlock the private note of Patrick's. It was morbid to keep it, even if she had not looked at it for years. She had never had the heart to tear it up because it had seemed part of Patrick. But of course that was absurd. It was no more part of Patrick than was the despair that filled him when he wrote, "I'm sorry, but I can't bear it any longer. Don't be angry with me. Patrick." She would take it out and burn it. Burning it would not blot it from her mind, of course, but there was nothing she could do about that. The round schoolboy letters were printed there for always, round that he had been so attached to. It was so like Patrick to apologize for taking his own life. Nancy, watching her friend's face, proffered what she considered to be consolation. "They say, you know, that when you throw yourself from a high place, you lose consciousness almost at once." "I don't think you did it that way, Nan." "No? But that was where the note was, on the cliff top." "Yes, but by the path down the gap to the shore." "Then what do you—" "I think he swam out." "Till he couldn't come back, you mean?" "Yes. When I was in loco parentis that time, when Bill and Nora were on holiday, we went several times to the gap, the children and I, to swim and have a picnic. And once when we were there, Patrick said that the best way to die would be to swim out until you were too tired to go any further. He said it quite matter-of-factly, of course. In those days, it was a mere academic matter. When I pointed out that drowning would still be drowning, he said, "But you would be so tired, you see. You wouldn't care anymore. The water would just take you." He loved the water. She was silent for a little and then blurted out the thing that had been her private nightmare for years. "I've always been afraid that when it was too late to come back." Bee's sidelong glance went to Nancy's beautiful protesting face. "Morbid, I know. Forget I said it." "I don't know how I could have forgotten," Nancy said, wondering. "The worst of pushing horrible things down into one's subconscious is that when they pop up again, they're as fresh as if they'd been in a refrigerator. You haven't allowed time to get at them, to mold them over a little." "I think a great many people have almost forgotten that Simon had a twin," Bee said, excusing, "or that he has not always been the heir. Certainly no one has mentioned Patrick to me since the coming-of-age celebrations had been in the air." Why was Patrick so inconsolable about his parents' death? All the children were wild with grief to begin with, of course, sick with it, but none more than another. Patrick seemed bewildered rather than inconsolable. "You mean Latchets belongs to me now?" I remember him saying, as if it was some strange idea, difficult to understand. Simon was impatient with him, I remember. Simon was always the brilliant one. I think that it was all too much for Patrick, too strange. The adrift feeling of being suddenly without his father and mother, and the weight of Latchets on his shoulders. It was too much for him, and he was so unhappy that he took away. Poor darling. It was wrong of me to forget him. Come, let us go get those eggs. You won't forget to let me have Alec's address, will you? A Lettingham must have an invitation. No, I'll look it up when I go back and telephone it to you. Can your latest moron take a telephone message? Just. Well, I'll stick to basic. She picked up her basket from the sideboard. I wonder if he would come. It is a long time since he has been to Clare. A country life is not Alec's idea of amusement, but an Ashby coming of age is surely something that would interest him. But Alec Loadings main interest in the Ashby coming of age was to blow the celebrations sky high. Actively engaged in pulling strings to that end, or rather, trying to pull strings. The strings weren't pulling very well. He was sitting in the back room at the Green Man, the remains of lunch spread before him, and beside him sat a young man. A boy, one would have said, but for something controlled and still that did not go with adolescence. Loading poured coffee for himself and sugared it liberally, casting a glance now and then at his companion, who was turning an almost empty beer glass round and round on the table. The movement was so deliberate that it hardly came under the heading of fidgeting. "Well," said Loading at last. "No." Loading took a mouth. "I'm not an actor." Something in the unaccented phrase seemed to sting Loading, and he flushed a little. "You're not asked to be emotional, if that's what you mean. There is no filial devotion to be simulated, you know. Only dutiful affection for an aunt you haven't seen in nearly 10 years, which one would expect to be more dutiful than affectionate." "No." "You young idiot, I'm offering you a fortune." "Half a fortune, and you're not offering me anything." "If I'm not offering it to you, what am I doing?" "Propositioning me," said the young man. He had not raised his eyes from his slowly turning beer. "You, to use your barbarous idiom, what is wrong with the proposition?" "It's crazy." "What is crazy about it, given the initial advantage of our existence, of your existence?" "No one could bring it off." "It is not so long since a famous general whose face was a household word, if you will forgive the metaphor, was impersonated quite successfully by an actor in broad daylight and in full view of the multitude." "That is quite different." "I agree. You aren't asked to impersonate any easier task." "No," said the young man. Loading kept his temper with a visible effort. He had a pink, collapsed face that reminded one of the underside of fresh mushrooms. The flesh hung away from his good Lettingham bones with a discouraged slackness, and the incipient pouches under his eyes detracted from their undoubted intelligence. Managers who had once cast him for gay young rakes now offered him nothing but discredited roués. "My God," he said suddenly, "your teeth!" He lifted his eyes for the first time, resting them incuriously on Loading. "What's the matter with my teeth?" he asked. "It's how they identify people nowadays. A dentist keeps a record of work, you know. I wonder where those kids went. Something would have to be done about that. Are those front teeth your own?" "The two middle ones are caps. They were kicked out." There was a London trip to see the dentist twice a year, once before Christmas and once in the summer. They went to the dentist in the morning and to a show in the afternoon, pantomime in the winter, and the tournament at Olympia in the summer. These are the kind of things you would have to know, by the way. "Yes?" The gentle monosyllable maddened Loden. "Look, Farrar, what are you frightened of? He's with that kid in the buff many a time, and he hadn't as much as a mole on him. He was so ordinary that you could order him by the dozen from any prep school in England. You are more like his brother at this moment than that kid ever was, twins though they were. I tell you, I thought for a moment that you were young Ashby. Isn't that good enough for you? You come and live with me for a fortnight. By the end of it, there won't be anything you don't know about the village of Clare and its inhabitants, nor anything about Latchett's. I know every last pantry in it, nor anything about the Ashbys. Can you swim?" I'm back to his glass of beer. "Swim well?" "Yes." "Don't you ever qualify a statement?" "Not unless it needs it." The kid could swim like an eel. That's the matter of ears, though. Yours look ordinary enough, and his must have been ordinary too, or I should remember. Anyone who has worked in a life class notices ears. But I must see what photographs of him exist. Front ones wouldn't matter, but real close-up of an ear might be a giveaway. I think I must take a trip to Claire and do some prospecting. Don't bother. Loading was silent for a moment. Then he said reasonably, "Tell me, do you believe my story at all?" "Your story?" "Do you believe that I am who I say I am, and that I come from a village called Claire, where there is someone who is practically your double? Do you believe that? Or do you think that this is just a way of getting you to come home with me?" "No, I didn't think it was that. I believe your story." "Well, thank heaven for that, at least," Loading said with a quirk of his eyebrow. "I know that my looks are not what they were, but I should be shattered to find that they suggested the predatory." "Well then, that's settled. Do you believe that you are as like young Ashby as I say?" For a whole turn of the glass, there was no answer. "On your own showing it is some time since you saw him." "But you don't have to be young Ashby. Just look like him. And believe me, you do. My God, how you do. It's something I wouldn't have believed unless I saw it with my own eyes. Something I've imagined only happened in books. And it is worth a fortune to you. You have only to put out your hand and take it." "Oh, no, I haven't." "Metaphorically speaking. Do you realize that except for the first year or so, your story would be truth? Amount of checking." His voice twisted into a comedy note. "Or would it?" "Oh, yes, it would check." "Well then, you have only to stow away on the Ira Jones out of Westover instead of going for a day trip to Dieppe. Et voila!" "How do you know there was a ship called the Ira Jones at Westover about then?" "About then? You do me scant justice, amigo. There was a ship of that repellent title at Westover the day the boy disappeared. I know, because I spent most of the day painting her. On canvas," and the old scowl went out before I had finished. "Bound for the Channel Islands. All my ships go out before I have finished painting them." There was silence for a little. "It's in your lap, Farrah. So is my table napkin. A fortune, a charming small estate. Security. Security, did you say?" After the initially. The light eyes that looked at him for a moment held a faint amusement. "Hasn't it occurred to you at all, Mr. Loading, that the gamble was yours? Mine? You're offering me the sweetest chance for a double cross that I ever heard of. I take your coaching, pass the exam, and forget about you. And you wouldn't be able to do a thing about it. How did you figure to keep tabs on me?" "I hadn't. No one with your Ashby looks of rectitude." The boy pushed away his glass. "Which must be why I don't take kindly to the idea of being a phony. Thank you for my lunch, Mr. Loading. If I had known what you had in mind when you asked me to lunch with you, I wouldn't have—" All right, don't apologize. And don't run away. We'll go together. You don't like my proposition? Very good, so be it. But you, on the other hand, fascinate me. I can hardly take my eyes off you, or believe that anything so unique exists. And since you are sure that my improper, there's nothing against our walking as far as the underground together." Loading paid for their lunch, and as they walked out of the Green Man, he said, "I won't ask where you were living, in case you think I want to hound you, but I shall give you my address in the hope that you will come to see me. Oh, no, not about the proposition. If it isn't your cup of tea, then it isn't your cup of tea. And if you felt like that, you certainly wouldn't make a success of it. No, not about my proposition. He paused artistically while they negotiated a street crossing. When my old home, Claire, was sold after my father's death, Nancy bundled together all the personal things in my room and sent them to me. A whole trunk full of rubbish, which I've never had the energy to get rid of, and a large proportion of it consists of snapshots and photographs of the companions of my youth. I think you would find it very interesting. He glanced sideways at the uncommunicative profile. He said, as they stopped at the entrance to the underground, "Do you play cards?" "Not with strangers," said the young man pleasantly. "I just wondered. I should be sorry. I've never met the perfect poker face until now, and I should be very sorry if it was being wasted on some nonconformist abstainer. Ah, well, here is my address. If by any chance I have fled from there, sorry I couldn't sell you on the idea of being an Ashby. You would have made an excellent master of latchets, I feel. Someone who was at home with horses and used to an outdoor life." The young man, who had made a gesture of farewell and was in the act of turning away, paused. "Horses?" he said. "Yes," Loading said, vaguely surprised. "It's a stud, you know. Very well thought of, I understand." And then turned away. Loading, watching him as he walked down the street, thought, I missed something. There was something he would have risen to, and I missed it. Why should he have nibbled at the word horse? He must be sick of them. Ah, well, perhaps he would come to see what his double looked like. Part 1 of BRAT FARRAR by Josephine Tey. Oh, my dear, I hope I've caught your interest because I do love this novel. So next week at 6 o'clock for Tales and Cocktails, we will have part 2 of BRAT FARRAR. Thank you so much. I keep getting that blooming message trying to reconnect. Well, anyway, good night, and I will see you again next week, part 2. Bye now.